Hello and welcome to the Arise interview. 60 minutes of big questions about the big stories from the news and beyond with fresh insight and critical analysis. I'm Charles Aniagolu. Coming up in the next hour, around the world, scientists are urgently working on the early stages of a vaccine to prevent people from getting sick with the coronavirus. It's a race against time to create the one thing we know that can stop a person from getting the virus and preventing it from spreading. So today we ask, why is it taking so long to develop a COVID-19 vaccine? We'll speak to the man in charge of the Nigerian government's Pharmaceutical Research Institute. And later, there are growing fears that the coronavirus could soon take hold in refugee and internally displaced persons camps in Nigeria and across Africa. Millions are housed in such camps around the continent, and many who live there don't have reliable access to information about the pandemic. We'll speak to one civil society organization that works in IDP camps in a moment. Now, even at their most effective, containment strategies for COVID-19 have only managed to slow the spread of the disease. All eyes are turned on the prospect of a vaccine because only such a preventive inoculation can confer immunity against the virus. About 35 companies and academic institutions around the world are engaged in a contest of speed, rushing to create such a vaccine. At least 4 of them have already been tested on animals, and one of them, developed by the Boston, USA biotech firm Moderna, is almost ready to begin human trials. This unprecedented speed is largely due to early Chinese efforts to sequence the genetic material of COVID-19. China shared that sequence in January, allowing research groups around the world to grow the live virus and study how it invades human cells. So, given all that, how long before we see an antidote to the coronavirus?
Was heroic on this. They did post the genetic sequence of it. Today, we have companies that can sit down with a computer and from that genetic sequence make what is a candidate vaccine. Now, a candidate vaccine obviously means it's not a licensed product. It's something that somebody wants to work on. But you're right, you have to have the right nomenclature, because candidate can mean I'm working on something, it's in my head, I'm just doing a little work on it, I've got something in a vial, I'm beginning to do testing on it. And so what we saw in that case was a company called Moderna. That was the first vaccine that went into humans. It's a messenger RNA-based system. I actually visited the company, not in this outbreak, but before, because the technology is interesting. And what they were able to do is in 42 days, make a candidate vaccine from the genetic sequence. They didn't need the organism. That now is in clinical testing. Now, there is no licensed mRNA vaccine. So we're going to have to figure out, is it safe? Does it work in all different age groups? How are we going to scale it up? All that. But there are many others who are using conventional vaccinology. So an example would be the French are working on a measles-based vaccine. So the idea is to put the spike protein in the measles vector, and it takes a little bit longer to do that work. But once you have that done, of course, we know how to make measles vaccine. We make hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of doses and provide it to the whole world. So if that was to work, that might be easier to scale up. So I think what we want in the race is to have multiple different vaccines moving forward. We don't want 1 or 2. We don't want 100 in the late stages because it's expensive and hard to do. But we want to have diversity of science approaches going forward.
Well, for more on global efforts to develop a COVID-19 vaccine, I'm joined now in the studio by the Director General of Nigeria's National Institute for Pharmaceutical Research, Dr. Obi Adigwe. Thank you very much indeed for coming in.
Good to be here, Charles.
On average, can you say how long it takes for a vaccine to get to market?
Well, the chap that just spoke in the trailer before you came on gave a good indication of where some of these efforts are. you have to start by understanding what classes of vaccines we have. You have the live attenuated vaccines, you have the inactivated, you have the toxoid vaccines, and then you have the biosynthetic. The one you mentioned earlier on in your intro, Moderna, falls into the last category, and that is a novel type of vaccine, like the chap mentioned earlier on. And one of the other intro materials they mentioned talked about animal testing. So those are the phases that any type of pharmaceutical intervention have to pass through. There is the preclinical stage, which is either in vitro, in vivo, that's animal testing, or in silico. You remember a few weeks ago, you invited me when we talked about halicin, and we talked about how people used artificial intelligence to put together models that could work on something. That's a new model in silico. And then after those three first phases, then you get to the clinical trials. That's when these vaccines are actually now being tested in human beings. And before it can get to market, there are at least 3 phases of clinical trials it has to go through. The one to test for safety, and then 2 to test for efficacy. So it's when it has been tested in those clinical trial phases for the safety and efficacy that you can talk about licensing a vaccine to come to market.
And of course, that process could take quite some time. Usually it takes 18 to 24 months. Usually it takes 18 to 24 months. But with COVID-19, with the way the entire world is looking at COVID-19 now, and everybody's trying to put in their own bit to ensure we get something, get a good intervention on the table. There's quite a lot of emphasis on cutting bureaucratic bottlenecks. So during an outbreak such as this one, COVID-19, where there is obviously huge political will and lots of money and lots of interest to speed up the process, does that give you the hope that the process will be faster this time?
It will be faster than 18 months. It will be faster than 18 months. But realistically, I don't think we'll be seeing a vaccine before 6 to 9 months, realistically. And it's all for a good reason. If you look back historically in how pharmaceuticals have come to market, there are a number of good examples of unethical practices or rushed clinical trials leading to unsavory outcomes. There's the Kano incident a few years ago, the antibiotic that came into Kano. There's the other one that happened in the 60s, that a drug was rushed to market, and then after a while, if we found out that children were being born without limbs or with deformed limbs. So these are all the type of incidents that have this clinical trials and rigorous testing regime are put together to avoid.
So these are the important stages, basically, that an immunization will need to have to comply with, such as this research, development, tests on animals, and that sort of thing. And it'll be mostly companies and academic institutions that will be working and racing to produce a vaccine such as this?
Well, it's actually, those are some of the main actors, but there are a lot more people involved. There are the regulatory agencies. So in Nigeria, NAFDAC, for instance. In America, the FDA. There is the NREC, that's the National Health Research Ethics Committee. These are all players that are involved. There will be the volunteers themselves, because when you get to the clinical trials, you would have to ask people, to volunteer to take the experimental treatment, and they'll be compared to another group of people who don't take the experimental treatment.
But where does your Institute for Pharmaceutical Research fit in? If, for instance, a vaccine is developed in America, the company Moderna, as you said, leading the pack. If it's brought to Nigeria, would you need to test it again? I mean, what would your contribution be to that process?
Well, we don't know exactly what type of vaccine it is, because all the data about that vaccine isn't out yet. But usually when you're bringing a new intervention to a new population, I mean, genetically, we're a bit different from the people in Western America, in Western Europe and the Americas. So there will be a need to also test, undertake, some form of clinical trials
in Nigeria,
in this setting. And that's where people like us can start to add value to what's being done with that.
And I understand that most of the coronavirus vaccine platforms that various groups are working on around the world are at the stage, because I'm sure you're monitoring it, at the preclinical stage. How long does the preclinical stage take before it moves on to the next stage?
It depends on your resources and your strategy. So the intro, one of the guys that talked in the intro mentioned, the putting together of some of the formulas in silico. That's a lot faster. You sit behind a computer, put together the algorithms, and in a matter of hours, you can get something you can actually predict can have some value. In vitro and in vivo with animals is a bit slower, because you need to inject the animals with the antigen, inject them with the vaccine, and then watch. So it depends on the amount of resources. And
but I understand that even with all the political will in the world, I mean, some vaccines just won't make it through the preclinical stage. I don't know what the situation is with the corona vaccine, but someone described the hurdles the vaccine has to overcome as a series of valleys of death.
Absolutely. We had SARS, we had MERS. SARS was in 2003, I think. MERS was in 2012. And there have been people, looking at vaccines for decades, literally. And they haven't come up with, interventions that can work. So it's not something that you can sit down and predict. But you must agree with me that the global efforts around coronavirus, there are people who would not talk to each other before, who are sitting down at the table and saying, how can we work together because of coronavirus? That portends that there will be a lot more progress for coronavirus compared to those other two examples.
Okay, stay with us, Dr. Adigwe. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat about global efforts to develop a COVID-19 vaccine. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Eniekolo. With COVID-19 spreading so rapidly around the world, the race for a coronavirus vaccine is more urgent and more coordinated than ever before. But the vaccine is still at a very early stage of development, where safety is paramount and efficacy can either block the disease completely, or in an emergency such as this, there could be a milder version, though ideally blocking is more desirable, because if you block, you can't pass the virus on, and you could even eradicate it altogether. So it is arguable that vaccines may not be the magic bullet for such a novel pathogen, because every vaccine does take some time, often many years, in fact, before it gets to be rolled out.
The critical issue here is going to be, we have to optimize for speed. And so that means, as I said, having examples of all the different new technologies that could potentially work, as well as conventional doses moving forward at the same time. So what you're going to want to do is have this bubble up. And it's not just companies, or big companies. It's also biotech companies. It's also academic researchers that are working on this. You want all of those to bubble up. Then you want to be able to, look at what's the most promising. And that will depend upon animal results. It'll depend upon being able to produce those vaccines, have a pathway. And eventually, you will want to put those into human clinical trials. That requires a certain amount of safety work. You can try to accelerate that. But then you need to say, okay, we need to know how, do we need one dose? Do we need multiple doses? Do we need, 50 micrograms, 100, 150? Do we need a chemical stimulant we call an adjuvant? Given that this disease has, it's big, problems in outcomes or in the elderly, we might need to put some stimulants in to make it a more potent immune response. So all of that work has to go on. That's what the clinical testing is. Eventually you say, aha, here's the vaccine we're going to use. Now you test it in an efficacy trial. And that is to see, does it work? And at that point, you then have a vaccine that works. But there is a stage after that. And that stage is you've got to, work out the manufacturing, have it all worked out so that, the regulators know that you can really make this and that it's pure, it doesn't have any problems with it.
And with me in the studio, the Director General of Nigeria's National Institute for Pharmaceutical Research, Dr. Obi Adigwe. Thank you for staying with us. And I understand that there's only one vaccine for COVID-19 that has started a phase 1 trial, and that's the one made by the Boston-based biotech firm Moderna. And phase 1 looks at safety, doesn't it? And whether the vaccine stimulates an immune response in the human body.
Yes, I actually think CanSino Biologics of China are also at the verge of starting a phase 1 clinical trial. And you're right that the first thing you look at is safety. You have to roll back a little to how vaccines work. What are vaccines, in fact? Pieces of virus, either attenuated or dead pieces or simulated pieces, which are put into the human body to elicit an immune response from the human system, so that when, God forbid, the antigen, you're faced with the antigen, your body already has a known response to attack the antigen and overwhelm it. And so the first thing you do, like you rightly said, is look at safety. After safety, you now look at efficacy. That's the phase 2 and the phase 3. Phase 2 clinical trials looks at efficacy, say in a few hundred people. Phase 3 would look at it in a broader,
much bigger sample,
exactly, thousands of people across different regions, looking at different demographics of the population. Is it good for pregnant women, for instance? Can it be used in pregnancy? Is it better in children? Do you have to vary the dose when you're applying it to elderly people? That's all what you do in the phase 2 and the phase 3 clinical trial. So that's, it's encouraging that people have gotten to phase 1 so quickly in a matter of months. But like I mentioned earlier, there has to be concerted effort for us to push through to get an outcome.
Right, and of course, COVID-19 is a novel pathogen. So it's not like the flu vaccine where you can repurpose or modify an existing platform. With the coronavirus, you have to go through all the stages to make sure. Is that correct?
Well, a bit. It's correct. But you can also learn from previous vaccine experiences. So
especially viruses.
Especially viruses.
Right.
Especially viruses. But even vaccines against other pathogens. So there was something I read in one of the peer-reviewed journals about the BCG vaccine seeming to offer some sort of protection in populations where it is common. BCG is the Bacillus calmette-guerin vaccine that we've used for years against tuberculosis.
Right.
Tuberculosis is a bacterium. So because it's novel, you can't exclude any former knowledge. You have to, everything is on the table. So you test everything and then identify what works for this particular novel virus, and then you put it in the mix.
I guess the big question on most people's minds is, obviously you're a doctor, you're an expert in what you're talking about. Most of us are not. So the ultimate question on most people's minds is, given all this political will around the world, is there any way that any of these phases can be safely fast-tracked, or are they already fast-tracking as much as they can?
They're fast-tracking, but I believe more can be done.
Yeah.
But you also need to put into the decision-making matrix that when you go past phase 1 and you're at the end of phase 2, phase 3, it is possible, depending on the potential of the vaccine, for people who are at huge risk to be exposed to experimental treatment. So that is also...
Yes, in other words, if somebody is dying already,
yes,
you might say, okay, well, let's try this on this
That's
person.
the physicians and the volunteers' call to make. Because you remember with Ebola,
right,
you know, even before the vaccines were approved by the regulatory agencies, vaccines that were still at the tail end of the clinical trials were given to Ebola populations for experimental treatment.
Yes.
So that is what political will can do. If you remember, 5, 6, 7 years ago, I think it was 5, 6 years ago, when Nigeria had Ebola, we asked for vaccines and we didn't get. However, recently, when it was in Democratic Republic of Congo, they asked for experimental vaccines and they got, because there was improved political will in that setting. It
was at a safer stage.
It was at a safer stage.
Right.
There was increased political will, and you know, there was now a sense of a better sense of working together for the second setting. So with coronavirus, it's as if we've skipped the Nigerian Ebola experience and everybody is at the Democratic Republic of Congo.
And everybody is ready to try it, basically.
Everybody, well, I wouldn't say everybody is ready to try it.
Right.
You know, because with coronavirus, let's look at the facts. If you're within certain demographics, your risk isn't, you know, as much as if you're in the other side, say in your 60s, you have an underlying illness, and you know you already have what do you call it now, impaired lung capacity. So weighing both of them, if you were a young healthy person who has a coronavirus, which literally will go through you like a common cold, you may think, I will not be exposing myself to experimental treatment. However, but if you were in the other category, you would say, you know, I would. So that's something to bear in mind, you know, while we're asking people to consider.
So basically, you need speed, but you must not rush because of safety and the fact that you're going to give the vaccine to millions of people, and you can't afford to find out afterwards that there are safety issues.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
So just moving forward, you mentioned the fact that there have been instances in the past when vaccines have been rushed through and rolled out and have developed problems and complications. And you talked about the Kano experience.
Yes. So I first talked about the thalidomide experience. That wasn't a vaccine. It was a pharmaceutical, but they're all classed. Vaccines are also therapeutic interventions. That's why they all go through similar processes. Thalidomide was a substance that was used for, I think it was an anxiolytic that was very popular in the West in the 60s and I think early 70s. And you know, the way we go through clinical trials today weren't so well defined back in those days. And then you had, you know, after people took thalidomide and, you know, started giving birth to children, we found out that there was a preponderance of children who had, you know, deformed arms and, you know, their limbs weren't well formed. And this was traced back to thalidomide. And then you also have to look at the ethics. While we're talking about, ensuring that, you know, you can push through the relevant speed using political will, you can't forget the ethics. If you remember, I mentioned that in Nigeria, you have NAFDAC on the one hand, and then you have the National Health Ethics Research Committee. Ethics is critical. A few decades ago, you remember there was this scandal in the US, where certain groups of people were denied treatment for syphilis, even though penicillins had, been proven to be effective against syphilis, and they lived through it all their lives. So that's an example of an area where ethics plays a role. If you're coming in with an intervention, will you be using your commercial, or big corporation power to be forcing your vaccines on people who don't require it? The National Health Ethics Research Committee will ensure that doesn't happen.
Okay. I have to say, very, very interesting and very educational. Dr. Obi Adigwe, thank you very much indeed.
You're welcome, Charles.
You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead, including growing fears that the coronavirus could soon take hold in refugee and internally displaced persons camps in Nigeria and across Africa. Stay with us.